thrilled you're all here. My name is Hannah Storm. I am the director of the Ethical Journalism Network. Today's conversation is about gendered harassment in the digital age. We hope it can be a conversation as well. So please do come up with some questions, and after we've had a chat with our colleagues, we will take questions as well. So if I can just introduce my colleagues now. I'm just wondering if there's anybody outside because I can hear some noise. Thank you, Ida. So if I can introduce my colleagues, to my right and to your left, Sarah Mamani is a radio journalist here in Jordan. She specialises in human rights journalism and is going to talk to us about some of the great work she has done in terms of making known some of the issues around online threats and online harassment. Next to her is Lujain Haj Youssef. She is the editor-in-chief of Radio Rosanna, which is a Syrian local radio network. They're based in Paris and Gaziantep, and non-partisan Syrian network. As I say, she's editor-in-chief, but specifically focused on women's issues. And she's going to talk to us a little bit about some of the unique areas of harassment that her colleagues have had to deal with. To my left and to your right is congratulations, recently, Dr. Julie Passetti.
Thank you.
She and I are long-term friends of a decade or so. Our paths have crossed across many different aspects of media and gender. Julie has worked at the interface of disinformation and misinformation, gendered harassment, all kinds of different tools that are used to target people into silence. She's the new global head of research at the ICFJ, and we're thrilled to have you all with us. I'm going to just talk very, very briefly about my involvement in this conversation. I used to run an organisation called INSEE, the International News Safety Institute, which looked at safety of journalists. And over the past 5 years or so, we became increasingly aware that safety was not just about war zones and conflict and humanitarian crises and environmental disasters. It was also about the safety issues that journalists, and predominantly women journalists, faced online as well. And we'll be talking about that a lot, and about some of the kind of different specific aspects that make issues so prevalent and relevant for women journalists, because we know that often women journalists are marginalised. And one of the motivations behind online harassment is to further marginalise and silence them. So I'm thrilled to have my colleagues again. Thank you. And I'm just going to move to you, Julie. Julie's going to give us a little bit of the global context before we move to our two colleagues from the region.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. And thanks, as Hannah said, for finding us in this cavern. I'm going to talk a bit about the global perspectives and context, partly because as much as we are in the Middle East, and we're in Jordan specifically, what we're speaking about is an internationally networked crisis, and we have to establish international responses that are effective to this crisis. And the crisis we're talking about I refer to as the new front line for journalism safety. And that new front line sees women at the epicentre of a trifecta of threats. Now that trifecta I define as a combination of gendered online harassment, that's very bright, digital security attacks, and orchestrated disinformation campaigns, which are often state-driven and which frequently target women journalists because of the capacity to chill very effectively any kind of investigative reporting, critical commentary, or critique broadly of an organisation, of a company, of a state. And we know from now 5 or 6 years worth of research by academics, by civil society organisations, and increasingly by journalists in journalistic capacity, that this is a problem that is both pernicious, that involves frequently sexualised attacks on women journalists. It means attacks that involve threats of rape, threats of very violent rape, and murder, and threats that radiate. So threats that radiate to the news organisations that are being targeted, as well as to the family members and sources and contacts and audiences of the journalists being targeted. So it has a direct impact on the ability to do investigative reporting, to do any kind of accountability journalism, and to engage with audiences in a safe way, which is, as we know, an essential component of journalistic work now. So I am currently with the International Centre for Journalists, where, as Hannah said, I've just begun as the Global Director of Research. But I'm bringing with me to ICFJ two concurrent projects, one of which was just announced last week or the week before, which is a global study to be done, funded by UNESCO, which is the UN agency that deals in freedom of expression and journalism safety, which will examine this crisis at an international level through building case studies and also identifying potential solutions around the world. We'll be looking at all 5 regions of the world as UNESCO denotes them. The Arab states will make up a proportionate number of the case studies that we do. So I'm here today also to encourage you to make contact with me or through colleagues within ICFJ, or even via Hannah or others who will collaborate on this work, to encourage you to contribute to it. I just want to also say that this is something that involves necessarily a degree of collaboration across borders, across organisations, and with journalists in their workplaces. And I think that's something that needs to be set up front as we look for solutions, because too often, as organisations working in the field of journalism development or security and safety, we have focused on solitary efforts. And this, as I said, is a networked problem, and it requires networked solutions that cross cultural boundaries, that cross national boundaries, and that cross organisational boundaries. So this is a pitch, please, to collaborate as much as possible. I was going to go through some data that we have gathered as part of the research project I'm looking on, but suffice it to say, if I was to summarise the great bulk of research and initiatives that have occurred over the past 5 or 10 years, as we realised that online harassment was becoming a new weapon of war, particularly as it intersects with disinformation. In summary, roughly around 2/3 of women journalists who have been surveyed in a range of surveys identify their experiences of online violence or online harassment as being evident and damaging. And among the impacts of these surveys, if we aggregate that data, women withdrawing from public conversation, women withdrawing from particular beats, and the beats, or the rounds as we call them in the UK, the themes of reporting that are most likely to trigger the sorts of onslaught of attacks include anything to do with feminism or women's equality, politics, migration, sport, technology, international conflict, a whole range of issues. But essentially,
basically everything.
It's pretty much the whole spectrum now.
Gaming, climate change.
Yep, climate change is another one that's a real vector. And on top of withdrawing from coverage of certain issues, women journalists identify also a desire to potentially withdraw altogether from the practice of journalism. This is the ultimate chilling effect, we could say, but I would go further and say, ultimately, the real cost is the threat of what's online crossing over to the physical realm, which is happening increasingly. And we can see in just 2 case studies from recent years, in fact both of them from 2017, Gauri Lankesh in India and Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, both of whom were murdered with impunity for their journalism, both of whom were brutally harassed online. As an early warning sign, this can be now identified in the context of dealing with journalism safety. So the offline impacts for people working on particularly high-risk stories or in particularly high-risk regions, as many of you will be doing, we can't overestimate the importance of connecting digital and physical safety. So I think I'll leave it there, Hannah.
Thank you. Thanks, Julie. I'm keen to ask you, Sarah, how much of this resonates? We heard from Julie about some of the subject areas that journalists are covering that become triggers for harassment. Can you paint a little bit about the picture that you're working in, the environment you're working in, please?
We have worked on an investigative journalist piece about electronic harassment when it attains the victims as a new kind of a new term that has been coined to start with, because we used to talk about sexual harassment in general, and now we're talking about electronic harassment and bullying of certain female journalists in Jordan. And this is a new phenomenon, or at least let's say that it is a shameful thing on along the path of journalism in Jordan. The number of female journalists who were subject to such electronic harassment or who saw their journalistic activities hampered amounted to around 90%, according to a certain journalist or journal that issued this statistics by the end of January of 2019. So that latest study showed that 90% of our female journalists are subject to such harassment on the social media platforms. We have a problem. Women, whether they are journalists or not journalists, do not come out. Most of them do not come out to reclaim their rights. We as female journalists should call for justice. And when we have a female journalist who's talking about this issue, it is not strong enough. We need to have also the support of men. They also should tackle this issue. I think if we have such a comprehensive approach, then we will achieve more justice towards Jordanian journalists. And when I say this is when I say that female journalists are subject to this harassment, I can also say that general women are subject to harassment. And again, I say that men should tackle this issue in a very fair manner.
I just have two brief questions for you. I just have two brief questions for you, and thank you so much for that. My first question to you is, are you able to share any examples of what the harassment looks like? How does it exist, in what form? My second question, and I'm so grateful that you call on men to be part of this, because when we're talking about gender issues, we need to include everybody. What would your message be to the men here in this room as to how they can amplify the great stuff you're doing, but how they can also give you solidarity to counter the harassment that you and your colleagues are experiencing?
Thank you, Hannah. The first example that comes to my mind when it comes to female journalist harassment is her profile on Facebook, harassment by her colleagues at work. The comments on the way she dresses, the way she writes, they will tell her, you are a woman. They always try to make her feel that she is presenting the topic because she is a woman and that she is incapable. And that she is incapable of coming up with a good product when it comes to investigative journalism, while we know that this is not true, of course. On TV, and if you watch some of the TV programs, you will hear so many comments on Facebook by some of the female journalists who are subjected to bullying. We're talking about Amman TV, Ru'ya TV. Whenever they put a picture, their picture or a poster of any program, whether it's a daily program or not, we will see that the comments thereon sometimes are or fall under harassment. And moreover, the comments tell her that you as a woman cannot achieve what the man has achieved. Of course, women are MPs, they are ministers, and women have achieved all leadership positions. So I would like to propose the other thing. Maybe the head of the female trade union should be a woman. Why not? If we have such a head in Jordan, a female journalist as head of the journalist union would be a very good example. We have so many examples. All of us have, we have our posts on the social media, and we see the comments on our posts. Most of the comments, when it comes to any investigative piece, it is considered as a part of harassment, or actually people ask us if such comments can be considered as harassment. Yes, they are harassment. Sometimes there is the issue, we deal with these comments by blocking the commentators in order to get rid of those people who make inappropriate comments. Now, my message to the males or to the men is the following. I think that men should look at the female issues from the female, that they should try to put themselves in the shoes of women. I would love for a man to empathize with women, to look at female issues from the female lenses. And we are all looking at gender issues from the women's point of view. But men should also call upon the rights of women and look at issues from women's perspectives and points of view. Another point is the promotion of male journalists and the absence of promotion of female journalists. Maybe we need to have, more kindergartens that kindergarten services avail to women, and they consider that female journalists, because they are mothers, they cannot stay long at work, and thus they cannot achieve high positions in journalism. So I propose to have more kindergartens in journalist media outlets.
I'm really struck by what you said about the promotion of more women in the news environment. EJN, you are editor-in-chief of Radio Rosanna, so it doesn't get much more important than that to that radio station. You are also doing incredible work in promoting the voices and issues that women face within the Syrian landscape. We had a chat yesterday and we talked about what harassment looks like in this context. Would you mind sharing some of your thoughts with us, please?
مساء الخير وشكرا للجميع بالانضمام إلى
Good afternoon. Rosanna Radio is a Syrian TV radio that was set up in 2013, and we were able to work with a wide network of correspondents. Some of them were female journalists who have been trained and and have been highly qualified and worked in a very efficient manner within Syria. Let me just note out as of the beginning the work of journalists in Syria, female journalists, citizen journalists in Syria. They worked under conflicts, but they also worked under other challenges. The fact that they are journalists who work in areas where people do not accept women in journalism, and then they also work in conflict zones. So these are two challenges, the gender and the area of conflict. And this means that many female journalists were incapable of working. Some of them had to wear the hijab in order to stop any harassment. And that was under the Daesh areas. But under Syrian government-controlled areas, also female journalists had problems. As of the beginning of 2013, we have been collecting a lot of harassments, and the worst of them was one of the female journalists' account who had her video or picture, her nude picture shown on the social media, and this issue was closed because it was a scandal, and it was related to a military leader in the region, and that's why the whole issue was closed, not because she was a female journalist, but because of the other party involved. We have worked on raising awareness of young journalists related to safety and security in order to afford them with security against electronic harassment and electronic assaults on their personal accounts. We have followed up on gender issues, and one of the investigations that we have produced, 18 females were harassed, and 90% of them had been subject to harassment at one point or the other of their lives. On another case study is related to females who are about to get married, and they were attacked by some of the trolls. And the main problem is when you have a female journalist who is very bold to talk about religion, sex, or politics, then she will really encounter a lot of trouble, because women should not go against the tide, and such attacks, such trolls are related to the issue of honor. It is always related to the issue of honor. A female journalist is always attacked because of her honor, and it is very easy. It's very difficult for her to defend herself because of this sensitive issue. So this is an issue, or this is a case that has been multiplied. And as the two speakers have said, this leads to isolation. Many female journalists believe it's much easier to remote themselves from journalism rather than encounter or confront these issues. So many experts, female journalists, have turned away from or shunned away from public life, and they never cover any public issues, religion, and even economical issues. We have noticed this very clearly, and we have talked about this in our programs and our awareness raising material. That was, in a nutshell, the situation of our work and what work on in our radio. Maybe I will just end with an example, a very distinguished thing that happened with us before I turn the mic over to Hannah, maybe. Social awareness and the media role when it comes to this issue is very important. So we had a program about women, and towards the beginning of the episodes, or the initial episodes, we touched upon some taboos, social taboos. However, the very balanced dialogue in such episodes allowed for a social communal debate on the live Facebook episodes. Some of the young males who were attacking the leader or the anchor woman, they were using inappropriate terms and they were insulting her. The fact that these young men used such insulting words meant that the community and the audience were replying, and this led to a social debate between the two parties. And that's where our role comes in, the importance of awareness raising. We cannot rely on law to help protect the journalists. No, we cannot rely on the law to change the mentality. It is us who should work on awareness raising, and this would help us as female journalists. This is also linked to a balanced role played by both males and females. We cannot afford protection to females without the assistance of males. It is a joint responsibility, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. That was really interesting. And we had a chat yesterday about some of the practical measures that you were adopting and some of the practical tools that you were using as well. I do want this, as we advertised, this to be a practical conversation. So let's try and, if there's any information people would like to share about what has worked or what hasn't worked, I'd very much welcome that. Just one quick question back to you, Lucien, is in terms of the practical responses you as an organisation are using to try to counter that harassment. Can you share a bit more about that, perhaps about the moderation that we were talking about?
كما ذكرت في الحديث هناك عدد.
I did say that there are various measurements that we have adopted when it comes to digital harassment of female journalists, enablement or empowerment of female journalists. We have to be aware of our important role. We should not withdraw. Any person who works in the public sphere should be aware that he will be or she will be attacked by the society at large, disagreed with because of her opinion or because of the fact that she is a female or a woman. We can also recommend that maybe some journalists can shun away from some of the social media because it is usually temporary. These electronic flies or trolling is temporary. And another issue that we recommend is to safeguard the personal and private information. We should not put all our information on the social media. We need to be aware of this. We should also not give away any information for free. We should also be able to have digital protection of our data. We should also be strong from inside. We should be able to encounter and confront others. Why should I be silenced? I should be strong. This is what we focus on. And
it's a really difficult thing to talk about sometimes, this. We've had, I was on the stage with Carol Cadwalada before, and, she's experienced a lot of harassment. So I applaud you for being able to talk about what you're going through. It's a really, really important thing. And thank you. Thank you so much. I just want to turn, before I take a question, I want to turn to Julie, because last year, Julie did an incredible piece of work looking at the responses by 3 female-led newsrooms around the world to orchestrated disinformation campaigns that targeted and harassed female journalists. And just, if you could very briefly just talk about some of the practical responses that they brought in.
Sure. I just want to say one thing first. I mean, this is psychologically damaging stuff, emotionally traumatizing stuff that we're dealing with. And one of the practical ways newsrooms are responding, increasingly, not everywhere, is to employ psychological support. But it's very hard to draw on that psychological support unless you feel safe to acknowledge there's a problem. And I think there's still a barrier there in many newsrooms, particularly male-led newsrooms, where women feel that they can't come forward and acknowledge a degree of fragility or vulnerability, because to do so implies a lack of capability in a man's world. And I think, I just want to echo that support. And to say that a woman I began connecting with in a professional sense around looking at social media-led news organisations way back in 2013, Maria Resso, who is the executive editor of Rappler in the Philippines, who's most recently known for being on the cover of Time magazine for what she says is holding the line against the bullies and the harassers, which are linked to the state. So while you were talking, I'm getting WhatsApp messages from her. She's just landed in the Philippines. Every time she goes home, she's worried she's going to be arrested. And she endures the sorts of harassment we're talking about here on a prolific scale, as so many other women do. And it's just worth bringing back home that, this fear that is driven by these prolific attacks and the way it goes to the very, the very heart of your practice and your existence. But to do what you said, which is to hold the line, as Maria says, and to keep talking and reporting about it is absolutely essential. But for those of us who are the subject of these attacks, we need the camaraderie of others to do the reporting. And to echo what Hannah was saying, it'd be fantastic if some men led some investigative journalism about the impacts of this sort of experience on freedom of expression internationally. But just to come back to Rappler, so it was actually... I've been studying Rappler since 2014, but this year, in fact, while I've been at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, leading for the past 18 months a project called the Journalism Innovation Project, which I'm going to talk about on a panel with Fatima and others tomorrow. That project was perhaps envisaged as one that would look at the shiny things, the technology that leads us into these new wonderful places to rebuild journalism. I pivoted that project to examine these three news organisations, Daily Maverick in the South African environment, the Philippines, Rappler, and the Quint in India. And it occurred to me that perhaps one of the biggest markers of capacity for innovation is the ability to respond to external threats and crises, and the common experience within these news organisations that are, as we say in English, punching well above their weight. They are doing groundbreaking, internationally recognised investigative reporting, was this spectre of gendered online harassment targeting female journalists as part of an orchestrated disinformation campaign connected to the state. Modi's India, Duterte's Philippines, and the Zuma regime formerly in South Africa. The things that they were doing that I think are practically useful include Maria Ressa's strategy of applying the investigative journalism lens to this crisis, and to use big data journalism and network analysis to expose the troll networks and their connections to the state actors. That's become one of their main thrusts as an investigative outfit. That was replicated at the Daily Maverick and to an extent at the Quint. Pulling back to more closed communities for online interaction in the interests of both the safety of their journalists but also the safety of their audiences, because in the overflow it was their audiences getting attacked as much as they were getting attacked, and you've kind of highlighted some of this. So they were increasingly looking at membership as a model with physical meetings with supporters who were more loyal. They talk about their loyal supporters as the ones who would fund their journalism and who would defend them in public spaces. One "it didn't work" type tip is from Maria, who now says, "I was so naive." One of the things she did and her team did was to launch a campaign, and I talk about this in the last Reuters Institute report actually that came out just last month. She had a campaign which was #NoPlaceForHate. So their altruistic objective was to try and transform these toxic audiences back into supportive, civil communities. And she says about that they were just so naive. It didn't work. It was a dismal failure. As much as there was early signs of relief from the audience, it actually in some ways exacerbated the experience of abuse. So as much as we might have thought, in 2014 or 2015 this was a brilliant approach, it didn't work for them. In South Africa, one important note to take is that they have started civil actions in the courts. So they're using, in their environment, with very strong freedom of expression protections in the Constitution and still strong courts, they're taking a legal approach to target the assailants, which is something that's also happened in Finland, and I think now there's a case in France as well. So this is an area to watch. And one final point from the Quint and others, but to highlight what the Quint does, it's a sort of network of support within their news organisations. And where you have a hierarchy with a woman in charge, this is obviously, I think, potentially easier. But ensuring that there are safe spaces and places for people to reveal what's happening and to get the support that they need, and to be pulled off the desks, the front line, and to flag stories that are likely to be incendiary or stories that will cause a flame war online, to alert people to that. So that's just a few tips, and I'm just going to take that for 2 seconds. Nice try. I just wanted to say, I just tweeted a link before this panel which has a whole bunch of the resources I'm talking about. So if you go on Twitter, the last tweet has links, so I don't need to keep referring to that.
Thank you. And I just echo a couple of things. Just because you're a journalist doesn't mean that you have to encounter harassment. It does not come with the job. Okay, it should not have to come with a job. We don't have to normalise it. this is abnormal behavior that we are dealing with. The other thing I would say is that for editors to commission diverse writers on diverse topics is really important. That is a tip that comes from a wonderful human being called Mary Hamilton, who used to be audience editor at the Guardian newspaper. I just want to take a couple of questions, and then I'd like to get responses from Lujane and Sarah. There were a couple of hands there's a lady over there, and there's a lady there, and there's a gentleman there. So the lady there, please, and then this lady here. Oh, another lady. Oh, excellent. I called a female colleague or a person or a human, however you'd like to identify. It would be great if you could just mention who you are.
English or Arabic, or it
Whatever's
doesn't
most
matter.
comfortable.
So my name is Kinda Hattar. I come from Transparency International, based in Berlin, but regional advisor for the Middle East and North Africa. One topic that we are working on heavily now, and we're just starting to crack some information and talk about, is a concept that is called sextortion, and which means sexual bribes that are asked in return of information. And I was wondering if, well, I'm pretty sure that journalists who look for information want to have access to information, especially if they are female, sometimes males, because we know that it goes over on both genders. Has this been a case, because we're trying to also get the media to speak about it as an issue of sexual bribe for information or for something, especially if it is from public officials, because this is where you can criminalize it if it comes under the use of authority for personal gains. So that's just my question.
Thank you. So let's, I'm going to note that question, and then we'll take a couple of questions, then we'll respond. There's a lady next to Zahara, and then there's a gentleman there, and then we'll go round again.
مرحبا رح أحكي بالعربي.
I will speak in Arabic. I'm Diana Maalid, a journalist from Lebanon. I share many of the comments you have mentioned. I also talk a lot on social media, issues related to women, to politics, and I am subject to many of the things that you talked about. I think confronting the audience, the public, is not easy. I do agree with you that we should not get used to or normalize harassment. These are not normal things, but we need to think about the nature of social media, because by time abusive words lose their meaning, many women withdraw or become introverted just because of one of two words of abuse were said to them. But abuse on social media has meaningless, it has valueless, it should not affect anyone. Many female journalists silenced themselves, they retreated because a few abusive words. We should not do that. We should. If I have the option of block, I blocked 5,000 people. So what? This will not make me change my mind. Women journalists need to recognize that this issue is not going to change in 1 or 2 or 10 years. Our politicians, our rules, our laws say the same thing. This does not mean we should accept or surrender. But let's say these abusive words are nonsense, are trash. We should not bother about them. We should not give them that significance and continue discussing important issues. We need to talk to women journalists that this issue, it is an important issue, but we should not make it the main thing. We should make it a secondary one, should not lead us to withdraw.
Practical advice to women. I think it's really important to say it's not really important, but it can be psychologically damaging. What would your practical advice be to female journalists who are dealing with terrible words thrown at them day in, day out?
مثل كل الزميلات.
Just like all other colleagues, at first, when I received these words, I would have a stomach ache. I would be fearful. I would tension. I don't continue. I just block that person. I don't personalize. I don't advise to make a personal attack. You attack political opinions that have to do with our rights. But no matter how much we are hurt because of the abusive words, we should not resort to that way, because the person who made those abusive words, who uttered them, will feel happy that they have achieved their control.
I acknowledge that what you're saying, and I think you're incredibly brave to be able to have that resilience. I do think that from a solidarity perspective, it's really important that we still recognise that we shouldn't have to deal with this as part of our daily jobs. I'm going to take a question from our colleague there, and then I'm going to ask our panellists to respond, if that's okay.
Salahdin Al-Maizi from Morocco, editor of Diversity, Moroccan news media. I will speak in Arabic. I
would like to share my colleagues' a case of a Moroccan colleague, Hajar Maysouni, who was arrested and was harassed not only by the community but also by the state, the Moroccan state. She was arrested with the charge of an abortion, that she underwent an abortion. She underwent a lot of social pressure, and that was just to silence her. She had covered a regional uprising in Morocco. She was silent, or an attempt was made to silence her by fabricating a charge that could harm her reputation, and at the end the Moroccan state was dropped rather by the king pardoning her, between brackets. The pressure of the state, which is known in authoritative countries like Morocco, there was also a pressure by the media and journalists and media professionals who are close to the state, who launched a campaign, a smearing campaign against her. It was a very strong one, especially that she comes from a family-related link to Islamist movements, that journalist. So we have systematic schemes to silence journalists, men and women alike, but particularly women journalists, and to deal with their private lives and issues that could embarrass them in personal freedoms aspect. There was a proposal that emphasis should be made on training women journalists and male journalists on human rights, and that we have the right to express our opinions in a clear stance, and even our own rights as journalists. We need to put the responsibility should lie with our media organizations. In social media, of course, we are expressing our own.
Are you going to ask? Is it a question that you're asking still?
No, it's not a question. It's a recommendation.
Okay, no, that's fine. Okay.
Two recommendations. First one is about trainings. More trainings for women journalists.
Arabic, if you want.
Arabic. Oh, sorry.
More training for on human rights and protecting women and men journalists, and that media organizations should bear the responsibility of protecting their journalists that are attacked or that are harassed in social media, because when an article is published, the news organization bears the responsibility.
Bearing some of the responsibility. Some of the practical tips I mentioned before, again, Mary Hamilton had said that it is the responsibility of those at the top of the news organizations and all the way down to register responsibility for this. So thank you for your input. I'm just going to take a response to the... I'm just going to mention one thing about sextortion for our colleague from Transparency International. This isn't new. We wrote a book about 8-9 years ago called No Woman's Land, after Tahrir Square. And a lot of the examples that the 40 women journalists who collaborated in that mentioned was how people were extorting them in that way. It's just reached a different level because it's happening in a different space. But as Julie mentioned before, this intersection between the digital and physical world is something that we can't get away from. It's just almost been exacerbated and amplified because of that digital media landscape. You wanted to say something, didn't you?
Sure. Shall I respond to some of these? Yeah. So one of the first things I would say as a sort of collective response to some of the comments and questions is that it's essential to integrate digital and physical training, and that there has to be gender sensitivity attached to that, whatever the training looks like. And the training should involve digital defensive strategies that allow you to secure your communications, that allow you to have a pattern of response for doxing and phishing and malware implantation and a whole range of other digital security acts of terrorism, really, if we want to, reappropriate that word in the way that it's occurring in a digital environment against journalists as a way of shutting them up. This is what it's about, and it involves, I think somebody over here highlighted, this invasion of privacy that leads to the moral damage that can be extremely risky for journalists working in environments where the damage can include physical punishments, if your reputation is damaged. The case study of Rana Ayub in India, which is very commonly known now, demonstrates this intersection of disinformation campaigns with online harassment of women journalists. She was the subject of a deepfake porn video, and she then began being attacked not just by the Hindu nationalists who were targeting her for her critical reporting of the Modi government, but also she became the target of retaliatory action by conservative Muslims within her community, she being a Muslim Indian. And these sorts of experiences, I have to say, go beyond our colleague who suggested that essentially we should grow thicker skin and be more resilient. We have to recognise these problems are very serious and they manifest in different ways in different parts of the world. And I think we actually have to accept that this is or a series of acts that are deeply damaging, and to actually say that we should just get on with it is in many ways counterproductive, I'm afraid. We need to be much more supportive of each other than that.
Your phone's recording you.
My phone is recording me. That's extremely spooky.
Can I move to Luciane about your to get some thoughts from you, and then Sarah, and then there's a few people over there who desperate to talk. So
yes, أنا فقط أريد أن أؤكد.
I just want to emphasize a point my colleague Diana said, which is the behavior that dates back with time ends. It does not. Even if there was a continuous attack, ignoring it with time, when that behavior loses its impact and its value, it is no longer, it will stop, will not continue. We have faced that. We had very positive results. Ignoring that behavior, these waves of electronic flies, house flies, and crows, digital crows, will stop, and bats, digital bats and crows. We, in our content, we need to enhance the image of a woman, a journalist who is successful, who is capable, who has proved herself, and we must empower our male and female colleagues in our work. I believe in Jordan, I would like to say specifically in Jordan, we have Women's Protection Center, Journalist Protection Center, and we have electronic crimes law. We have lengthy articles in it, detailed, and a provision has specified that comments are things that could be punished by law. This is an electronic crimes law. Second, if you want to talk seriously, any fairness, any dealing with women, journalists, women dealing with the women fairly starts at their home. It should be fair to women since she is born. Women are born. How you treat women is the way, girls is how you would build or promote, empower women or destroy them. You as men, you need to accept that difference in work is healthy. It's good that we have male and female journalists. It would be boring if all who work in the press are men or only women. I believe the diversity is good. In our future content, we will support that difference is healthy, that we should have laws that deter and protect women from any bullying or harassment from the community. Thank you.
Just do want to flag, we're short on time. I'm really sorry about that. Tomorrow, however, there is an organisation, there's a panel that we're doing with Nadine, who's going to wave at me now, from the IWMF and Women in News. It's in the big ballroom. We're going to talk about gender representation in newsrooms. So hopefully we'll touch on some of this too. So please all come along. There's two questions. The lady with the scarf, do you want to ask the question? You answered, okay. The chap with his arm on the chair, yep. And then a lady at the front, and then a chap at the back. Let's take you three.
I'll be very quick. I'm a male editor looking to tell more diverse stories from a more diverse audience. So if there are journalists in the room who are interested in pitching those stories, I work for the Thomson Reuters Foundation. We cover human rights, women's rights, LGBT rights, and climate change. My question is, clearly some of the mistreatment of women journalists comes from their male counterparts, their editors-in-chiefs, and I wanted to ask our Jordanian colleague their views on the public naming and shaming of such male journalists. There was a recent list that was published in the US naming and shaming certain male journalists written by female journalists. So any thoughts on that as a way forward?
To Sarah, the question to Sarah.
Yeah, to Sarah.
Okay, thank you. Just bear with us 1 second. The lady at the front.
Ruba Anabtawi. 2 years ago, I was on that podium and talked about harassment against Palestinian journalists, and harassment was the topic. From your very rich and important discussion as a Palestinian journalist, I want to focus on training and raising awareness of beginner women journalists. She is the one who is most likely to be harassed. She is not confident of herself. No matter how strong she is in the street and work, this person might be silent because she is interested in her work and to continue working. All beginner women journalists know that is true. Women journalists sometimes cannot face up to that her boss. And also, she is not interested to have a confrontation and lose her job because we have a very high level of unemployment. How could men play a door here? Why are men in media organization keep silent about abusive bosses or editors, or at least give her a warning? Give their colleagues a warning that this guy might harass you, or it would be even better to go file a complaint. Unfortunately, men journalists overlook, turn a blind eye.
But those two questions are actually quite interlinked, so just bear with us 1 second. Man at the back, yep, waving at me, and then a lady there, and then that's going to have to be it for questions, and then we'll respond if that's okay. If you can make it as brief as possible, I'm sorry to...
It's okay. Do you think that women empowerment in the news sector should be systematic, or should it be occurring organically? Do you think that there should be an excessive effort to include women into the news sector, and also in terms of also to fight harassment? And one I want to direct to Ms. Sarah. And there's
there's a candidate, woman candidate for the Journalists Association, Farha Brazat. I hope that she will win. Both support her. So yes, I do support her. And I call for our Jordanians to support her.
With the cream top on.
Hi, thanks so much for the panel. You spoke a lot about isolation, and part of that isolation is that it feels like this conversation about how to protect ourselves as women journalists is internal, is amongst women journalists. And I'm wondering if it's time that we apply pressure on organizations like the Committee for the Protection of Journalists, CPJ, to also measure gendered harassment as something that affects journalism in general, just as it measures murders or people who are arrested, or keeps track of that, and whether this could help, us feel like it's something that threatens all journalists, not just women journalists.
Thank you very much. Okay. Oh, and a lady there. Let's take your question, and then we'll have to. That'll be the last question. And I would just say, while we're getting the microphone over there, I think that you're a really important point, the gentleman at the back with the blue blazer, about women empowering in the news sector. Maybe we can address that tomorrow on the gender representation panel, because we've got more time then. If that's okay with you, we're happy to take that offline outside of this. Our colleague there, yeah.
مرحبا أنا محامية من سوريا.
I am a lawyer from Syria. I want to say yes, in our laws in Arab countries, there is no definition in our laws for harassment. Therefore, in all Arab countries, in addition, we don't have harassment at work. This is something that we have been demanding to have since the Dow days.
Did you waving at me? Have you got okay, quick comment. Yeah, wait for the mic. Wait. Thanks.
I want to comment. Sarah. Sarah and the lawyer, you are I think you are giving an impression about something that used to be a long time ago in Jordan, the idea of having nurseries or to have kindergartens for women journalists at their places of work. But of course we have that. Also you are asking for men should talk about harassment against women, but men are supporting this action. You can see there have been Min Abu Yahya yesterday toured Jordan and said Jordan has changed a lot since the last time he came to Jordan 10 years ago. So this idea that you are delivering is very wrong.
If it's been raised here as well, it means that it's still not happening. So I appreciate what you're saying. Thank you very much. I'm just going to take one quick mention. I've been doing some work with the Poynter Institute in the United States around building curriculums to counter sexual harassment in newsrooms. What I would say to our colleague from Palestine is that nearly always it's the people who are most vulnerable. The people who are most vulnerable who are the people who are most likely to be subjected to harassment. So it's the interns, so it's the new journalists, so it's the people who feel marginalised already. And until we shake the very foundation of the systemic inequity of our industry, which where I live is white and male, we're not going to recognise that. CPJ is doing stuff. IWMF, Nadine there is doing some amazing stuff. There are so many great organisations doing there, but there is still something dysfunctional about the industry that almost needs an entire sea change. Julie, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I think the elephant in the room in this conversation, unlike the plenary, is the absence of discussion about the platforms. So when we talk about responsibility and the need for women to do either one of two things, to constantly delete or to ignore it so that it
block أو في الصمت، كل هذه الأمور لا يمكن أن تستمر كجزء من كوسيلة للرد والاستجابة. هاي قد تكون جزءا منها لكن لا يمكن أن تتم دائما. لكن الإساءة والجوانب السامة التي توجد لدى الجمهور توجد هناك. فأثر هذا العنف الرقمي على النساء وعلى محاولة إصمات الحق في التعبير وإيقافه. فإذا الآن الكرة في ملعب المنصات التواصل الاجتماعي. المنصات هي التي يجب أن تتحمل. والمشروع الذي تحدثت عنه تقوم عليه اليونسكو، بدأنا نرى مستوى عاليا في نظامات الأمم المتحدة. هناك قرارات صدرت من الأمم المتحدة حول هذا الموضوع، فيمكننا أن نبدأ بالتفكير على الاستناد إليها في تقاريرنا في أعمالنا المناصرة هذه الجماهيرية. من المفهوم أنه هذه كمشكلة هذا يؤثر على الصحافة كلها وليس على النساء الصحفيات فقط. مايكروفون. زميلتاي إن رغبتن أن تجبن على الأسئلة التي طرحت. هناك الزميل الذي سأل لك، ربما لجين تودين إضافة، وسيكون علينا أن ننهي أعمالنا.
اللي بيقوم للتحرش بالعمل أو هاي الأماكن يمكن طبعا بصير وكثير حلو، وأنا بعمل حاليا على ملف
currently on a certain investigation that is related to harassments against female journalists in Jordan. It is very important for journalists not to keep silent just because she wants to keep her salary. Because we need to talk about these issues, and we need to go to the police and lodge complaints. This way, this is the only way that we can hold the criminals accountable for their crimes. I agree with what Dr. Julia said when it comes to the importance of this harassment. Harassment does not only target women, but also targets men. I did not want to say that it is exclusive to women. I also agree with you that we need to empower new journalists when they start their work in order for them to be aware of what the issues they might come up against. A third recommendation, I agree with you, ma'am, about the need to have a law in Syria. Indeed, there are no laws that would protect women when it comes to harassment and electronic harassment. And even when we are talking about electronic crimes, we have not touched upon this issue. And the most dire thing when it comes to Syrian journalists is that they are not all in Syria. They are in the diaspora. And it is very difficult to protect these women from a legal point of view if they are out of Syria and they are all over the place. I also agree with the fact that our organizations require two kinds of supports that should be given to Syrian journalists, female journalists. Thank you.
Sarah and Lujane and Julie, and thank you, all of you, for being such an engaged and interesting and listening audience. Again, tomorrow, please come along. Two things. In the morning, we have a needs assessment conversation around we as my organisation has some money to do a project for an online tool on ethics and gender. We'd love to hear your thoughts as to where we might be able to spend that money and what's needed. And then second of all, in the ballroom, we've got the gender representation in the newsroom panel. So please do come along. And sorry?
And one more. It's 5 o'clock tomorrow. There's another panel.
At 5 o'clock tomorrow, I draw your attention to that panel there, whose name we're just trying to bring up.
It's okay. It's
5 o'clock tomorrow. But thank you, everybody. Thank you.